Hello. Well, it's true, isn't it, that in our walk with God, there are some times that are really good and times that we feel very close to the Lord and we're just really rejoicing in our relationship with Him. But conversely, it's also true that there are times that are very hard, times that we do not feel close to our Heavenly Father. And we don't always know why that's happened, although we tend to speculate whether maybe it might be some sin that we think we're struggling with or whatever. But at any rate, those times are very difficult and they feel very dry and they're often very lonely and really just hard. And when I was a child, we used to call those times wilderness experiences. It's not a term we use that much anymore, but in the 80s, everything had a name. And so I've decided today to tell you about my own personal wilderness experience, which was very, very hard and very painful for me. I think it started with quite a lot of loss in my life. The major one being that of my dad in 2005. He was an older father, so I think a lot of people didn't quite understand why I felt so shocked at his death. But I do think that had quite a lot to do with his personality. Anyone that remembers my dad will know that he was sort of a bit of a gentle giant, 6'7", very big, well-built man. And nothing ever really seemed to knock my dad for six. He had fought in the Second World War and he had come back when so many of his very close friends had not. He had walked out of Harefield Hospital having had no less than 2 heart attacks, only to be told by a doctor a few months later that whatever it was that carried him off, in the end, it wouldn't be his heart. He had spent his life being the most predictable man on the planet, and I always knew what he was going to do. But then one day he did something that he had never done before, something I really, really didn't expect. He had never died before, and suddenly it seemed to me that if my dad could die, then the universe no longer held any rules. I remember walking down the road one day, not long after he'd died, and just feeling that the slightest puff of wind could blow me away. Even gravity didn't seem to be something that I could actually rely on because my dad had died. Anything could happen. Shortly afterwards, my mum moved out of the family home, and so I actually lost my childhood home too. And I think the loss of my dad made that extra loss seem much, much bigger and harder than it actually was. But that too was devastating. Well, I had to move because of that, and so it seemed a sensible idea to move closer to where I was currently working at the time, which meant that I unwittingly cut off my support network because I was no longer able to attend Emmanuel at that time. And I wasn't really able, sadly, to settle in churches in my new area. I didn't find them very welcoming. And what that meant was that I stopped going to church. And I felt a level of guilt about that, which initially was small, but eventually it grew to such a degree that I didn't feel able to pray or to attend church at all, or do anything, in fact, that might remind God of my existence, because I felt so much of a failure and I felt so condemned. How could God possibly want me, possibly use me? And that went on for a period of 4 years. It was really dry, it was really lonely, and it was really crippling. Well, eventually things did have to change. I was very well aware of that. So I actually moved back intentionally to this Northwood area so that I could start going to Emmanuel again and hopefully pick up with my friends and really kind of get the support I needed to come back to God. But although I did that, it didn't actually really help, because although I was in the environment again where I could get the support, I was too afraid to open my heart to God, because it was where I was storing all my sense of guilt and condemnation and failure. I don't know, those of you who are parents, we used to do this as kids, when you ask your child to tidy their bedroom and they don't really want to. So what they do is they get all their toys and all their clothes previously, which have been strewn all over the floor, and they shove them into a cupboard, and then they stand against the cupboard to make sure everything doesn't fall out. And that is exactly really what I was doing with my heart, because I couldn't open it, because it was where I was storing all those awful things that I was thinking about myself. And I held it until I was exhausted, which was a long time. And that really was my wilderness experience. And it was dry and lonely and crippling for me. So why do I tell you? Well, I tell you because I really want to encourage you. There's a couple of observations that on the other side of my wilderness experience I want to share with you, in the hope that if you are in that place today, that you would be encouraged that there is another side to it, or maybe something to remember for the future if it ever happens to you. Firstly, I think all too often we imagine that there must be some sin that has caused us to be in what I'm loosely calling the wilderness today. But the Bible doesn't always indicate that that is the case. Of course, if we are struggling with sin, it does feel harder to draw close to God. But the Bible does not indicate that the only reason that you were in the wilderness is because of sin. Think about Jesus. He was called by the Spirit to go into the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights. But Jesus was without sin, we know that, so that certainly wasn't why he was there. And Acts chapter 8 records Philip, the apostle, being told by the Holy Spirit to go down to the desert road. Go down to the desert road. That was not a very safe road in those times. It wasn't nice, it was hot, it was dry, it was all sorts of things. It's kind of like choosing a farm track when you could go up the M1. Not what you would do naturally. But Philip went to the wilderness because he was obeying God's command. Sometimes I think the same is true of us. Hard though it is, we're actually occasionally called to be there. My second observation, and this is a really important one, is that God always has a purpose for the wilderness. Jesus, it was a preparation for his ministry, and what a ministry it was. Hebrews says that he effected a great salvation for us, and I think that is literally the best description of what Jesus did. What a great salvation he effected for us. And Philip, he was specifically told by the Holy Spirit to go down to the wilderness. Why? Because when he was there, he met an Ethiopian official who was a very influential man. He opened the scriptures with that man. He shared the gospel. He baptized that man. That man's life was completely changed forever. And given that he was an influential man, when he returned home or to his job or whatever it was, how many people would he have shared the gospel with in his turn, allowing the Church of Christ to grow in that time? There is a purpose when we're in the wilderness. God always has a purpose. For the Israelites, they were in the wilderness for 40 years, and it was their way to the promised land. And my final observation is that the wilderness, nasty though it feels, it might be a pathway that you have to walk through, but it is never the destination. It is never the end of the story. It is never the terminus. It's never the end. There is another side, and God will bring you through. And I know that he will bring you through because that is what he did for me. I can prove that in my life, in all that sense of failure and all the sense that I was lost. God had not lost sight of me. I was a person that had lost her earthly father and lost sight of her heavenly one. But not for one instant had he lost sight of me. He hadn't condemned me. He hadn't abandoned me or any of the other things that I was fearing. And he won't do that for you either. He loves you. So go before his throne with confidence and don't wait. God bless you.